Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Breeze. Breezeway Productions The Breeze. We're bringing the latest in independent films and film festival news, and we're continuing our coverage of this year's Tribeca Film Festival, the 2023 edition, with a great film team that we have here that is showcasing their doc, The Fourth Wall. We have Luke Meyer and Keith Newton. How are you guys?
Great.
Good to be here.
Thanks for having us here.
Well, I'm happy to have you guys on the show because I was able to check out this very compelling doc. Tell me a little about The Fourth Wall for our viewers.
So The Fourth Wall is a documentary series. We're showing the first episode of 4 at Tribeca. And it covers both the history of this psychotherapy group that was alternately called the Sullivanians, or the Fourth Wall itself, and I'll get to why it had that name in a moment. Because one of the things that the group did is they also had a theater company, and involvement in the theater was compulsory for everyone involved in it. So it was kind of 6 of one, half dozen the other. If you were in the group, you were also in the Fourth Wall Theater Company. So that name kind of carried over to everything.
Interesting. Okay, so you were also, or Keith, you were involved in this from the family background heading into it, correct? So this is something that you knew your family was involved with?
Yeah, I grew up in it until I was about 17, which is the year it all collapsed. Also, the year my father, Saul Newton, who was one of the leaders of the group, one of the founders, as well, the year he died, 1991, and that's when it all ended. And I left, as everybody did. We sort of scattered mostly around the New York area, but I went away from the city for a while, not quite realizing why I needed to get away at the time. But looking back, I obviously needed, a new start. So I think a lot of people did. So yeah, so I grew up in it. My whole childhood was in it. But the interesting thing about this group was that it was in, on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. So it was just sort of like, immersed within the city. So people looked the same as everybody else. The kids all went to normal schools around the city. So we were sort of, like embedded in normal society, but we were coming home to this very strange community, inside of it all. So
think it's fascinating. So you have this organization, this group of people, and that it was built up and then considered a cult. How were people brought into this, or how did they end up finding out about it? Was it just because they were doing, performances and then they just kept going? Like what tied them in? How did that
No, the theater really developed later, and in a lot of ways, it was, a way to maintain control of this group of young people who were finding, finding their own creative outlets, and the leaders of the group, saw an opening to exert greater control and sort of channel the energies into this sort of singular functioning organization. But really, people got into it through therapy. Therapy was the key, sort of recruitment mechanism. So people didn't realize they were joining a group of any kind, let alone a cult. They just thought they were getting into therapy. So there were a lot of them were young people new to the city, a lot of students. Especially there was a time there were a lot of Columbia students involved. This was the Upper West Side. So somebody would get a referral to see a therapist, and the therapy happened over time, as a process. So I don't know if you've read Lawrence Wright's book about Scientology, but he has this idea called the process of belief. So that, taking on a new ideology, joining a cult, sort of changing your version of reality, takes time, and there has to be some kind of process that unfolds. So for the Sullivanians, that process was therapy. So, therapy, they would start it's seemingly like normal therapy. You would, take your history of your whole life, talk about your family, and then slowly sort of the screws would turn a bit. And, the therapist would, tell you, well, maybe you should be seeing other people. It's okay to, cheat on your wife or cheat on your partner, or maybe you're spending too much time with your own children or with your parents, or maybe you should be living communally with these other people who are also in therapy, and you'll, learn more about yourself if you're living with them, in this more communal environment. So it's like piece by piece, You know, people were brought in not only to a different way of seeing the world and seeing themselves, but also into the community.
Yeah, there was someone we interviewed for it who said, I'm always asked about how I joined, and he said there was no joining. I walked into a therapy office on that day. It all went from there.
And the leader of it, Saul, which is like the main focus of the ringleader, so to say, and his wife, or one of his 6 wives that he had many people over the course of his life. He said he was more of a concept than he was a man, which I thought was also pretty interesting. Could you like elaborate on what that means by this Saul, who was like the head of it, is a concept?
I mean, go ahead, Luke.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's typical of people who are charismatic leaders, right? The idea of who they are is way outsized of what a human being actually is. And that's how people get swept up by it, is that they seem so larger than life, and to somehow contain a power that is incomprehensible, that it would be a person. And those are characteristics of a cult leader, you know. I mean, something that we're very interested in exploring with this documentary is that, and we were talking about this a little bit before, that like cults are really not that far from normal life. Like being in a cult is not that far from normal life. And so when we talk about sort of the power of a cult leader and what the characteristics are of that, I mean, those are not unique to a cult leader, right? You might see those in your boss at work, right? Who's somehow able to like get you to do tasks that you really don't want to do or don't even think should happen by some sort of coercion. It might be in a relationship. It might be like an unhealthy friendship. You know, it could be all these places where these characteristics of interpersonal control come out. We all experience it, right? And then in a cult, it's focused. It's some sort of leadership structure that takes advantage of that interpersonal abuse, and can kind of make a communal organization out of it.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating.
That's what we see with the fourth wall. And, yeah.
I've never heard of them before. And that New York City, you know, people talk and people are aware of things that happen and goes on. Word spreads pretty quickly. But it gets really deep and really dark very quickly. And that things as the course of the episode goes on, it showcases really how a lot of people did some horrifying things under the control of the people that were at the top tier of therapy, so to say, or what they thought was good therapy at the time. Let's talk about some of the subjects that you have that are involved in this. How did you go and then pursue them? Because some of them were not 100% ready to divulge. Some of them were more than happy to. You had some very famous names that were in here. Like I saw Wes Craven and Joan Harvey. So how did you put together a list of people that were ready to talk about this?
We really started this process with, the people I was in contact with already from the group, and we expanded out from there. So I had some of the kids that I had grown up with who had, were my age. Some of them I had lost touch with after the group fell apart. And when we reconnected as adults, and started sharing stories of our childhoods, it was actually one of the impetuses for me to start this project, this investigation into the past, because these the stories that I was hearing were not things that were shared when we were kids. So beyond that, each person I talked to maybe led to somebody else. There was a woman, Amy Siskind, who had written a book, an academic book about the history of the group that Luke and I both read, obviously as part of our research, but she was one of the first people we approached. So there were some clear people to go to first. And then of course there's my mother, who was one of the leaders, the lead therapist, Saul, as you were talking about, his sixth wife. And she was actually the only one of the leaders who were still alive. There were 4 main leaders, and she was the only one who's still alive. So obviously we, wanted to talk to her. So she was one of the first people we approached, some of my siblings as well. And sort of, we just expanded out from there. I mean, we there were hundreds of people involved in this. So we knew we didn't need to talk to everybody, but we did know, because it was very hierarchical, obviously, this group. So we needed to talk to people at each level of the hierarchy. We knew we needed to talk to therapists. We knew we needed to talk to members. We knew we needed to talk to kids. You know, some people just sort of like materialized for us without us even, you know, actually tracking them down, like Wes Craven. Luke can tell that story, but it kind of landed in our laps, really.
Yeah,
I mean,
did it inspire some of his horror films? Going through some horror stories of that?
I mean, I
we
think
kind of think
so.
it did.
I just, yeah, he never wanted to talk about this until this was the first interview he talked about it publicly. But I think, and I feel like I think with a lot of confidence, actually, from the conversation we had, that this really did inform some things, some ideas that he was working with in a lot of his films from there on out. I mean, he made this right before, or he didn't make this. He was in the group right before he made The Hills Have Eyes, and so everything after that had some information coming from his experience in the Sullivanian group.
That's wild. That's absolutely wild to see that. It was so crazy that it must be from real life. Like, writers know what they write what they know. So if this is something that he knew and was going through, he took from that and used those emotions or experiences and put that more into horror. Truly horrifying stuff. And as I was talking about before, I feel like the ideology of the cult is something that is really entering into the main cultural eyesight or mainframe. Like, if you look on all the streaming platforms, you can find cults like about Nexium. There was another cult about Waco. There's another one with Jonestown, and now with this cult, the Sullivanians. It's just, there's so many cults out there. Going Clear was another film that I saw that was also mind-blowing. These things are just so interesting to me, and I think a lot of other people as well, because it's really fascinating to see what goes on. So this is playing at the Tribeca Film Festival. You guys have one more screening. Do you know when and where that film will be screening, or your film will be screening?
Yeah, it's Sunday the 18th at noon at the Village East Cinema.
Right on. Okay. Yeah. Well, we hope everyone is able to check that out. We'll put the link for the tickets below. So if anybody's interested in that, you can go and check out the film. I want to thank you both for your time and speaking with me today, Luke Meyer and Keith Newton. So make sure to check out The Fourth Wall.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.